My name is Rebecca Craven. I'm the program director for the Trust, and I'm happy to be here moderating the panel. Our panelists today are Jim Oswell with Naviq Consulting from Calgary, Linda Daugherty from PHMSA, who I think everybody knows, and Rich St. Amour from the new president of Marathon Pipeline. I'm going to ask each of them to give a short introduction of themselves and their role with respect to geohazards, and then we'll get into the conversation. Rich, you want to start?
Sure. Again, I'm Rich St. Amour with Marathon Pipeline. So prior to my current role, I was our Director of Logistics and Engineering, which included our integrity functions for MPL. And I'm also part of the LIPA API Performance Excellence Team and the Pipeline Safety Excellence Team as well, and the steering committee that oversees the PET as well as some other functions. So with that, I've got about 26 years in the industry, all within the midstream space, primarily with light products, loading facilities and or products, both crude products and HVLs.
Thanks. Jim?
Good morning, I'm Jim Oswell. You will very quickly recognize my Canadian accent because I say route instead of route. And I've been in meetings with both PHMSA and FERC, and the first thing, within about 30 seconds, the fellows in Washington said, "Oh, you're the Canadian one. We knew there was a Canadian fellow coming." I'm a geotechnical engineer. I specialize in soil pipe interaction on the soil side, not on the stress analysis side, and geohazards and geological hazards. I've got work experience in pipelines in many areas, Canada, Alaska, Russia, China, South America, the US. It's a delight to be invited to this panel and the conference.
I'm Linda Daugherty. It somewhat concerns me when Rebecca says everybody knows me. I'm thinking, oh, is that not good? But I'll share with my Canadian friend. I was in Calgary at the International Pipeline Conference. And I was talking to some folks, and they said, oh, you're from the deep south. And I'm like, no, I'm from the Midwest. But I guess if you're Canadian, that's deep south, right? But anyway, Linda Daugherty. I've worked at PHMSA and its predecessor, RISPA, for many of you older folks in the room, for now 31 years. So this has been my life's work, pipeline safety and helping folks. I've been to many PST conferences, and they get better every year. They modify and change over time, but it's really good. So thank you for the invite. My job at PHMSA, I work with all of our field operations folks. So all of our inspectors, our investigators, people that do enforcement, also our community liaisons. I think you saw we have several of them here. They're all clustered in the corner in that group, so mix folks. But anyway, that's what I do. So I'm looking forward to our conversation here.
Great.
Okay.
So we're starting off with a bunch of lovely pictures that Linda was generous enough to bring. It's very difficult to find non-copyrighted photos of failures. They tend to all be from news organizations who don't like you to reuse them. So Linda brought some from PHMSA, and we're grateful for that. She's going to walk through these, and then Jim, I'd like you to talk about geohazards and describe some of the ways they can cause damage to the pipelines and cause them to fail. Some of that will be readily apparent from these pictures.
So I only have 3 different situations here. How many were in Chris Rule I shouldn't say Chris Rule, the accident panel with Kim West and Chris Rule? Some of the pictures you're going to see are going to be very familiar, but I wanted to share them with everybody else in the audience that didn't have an opportunity. So we know that geohazards, well, let me back up. How many would agree that Mother Nature can be extremely powerful? Okay, we all agree. And when she gets irate, major things happen. So this right here, you can see, there's the pipeline right here. And notice this. This looks like a pretty serious landslide, right? It happened in the aftermath of Ida in 21, but I want to show you a different perspective that shows you how extreme this really is. Could you go to the next slide? What's really interesting, I would not want to have been on that train track, you know, but the pipeline did survive. I'm not saying that's, I mean, look, we don't ever want to see this, but what was really interesting is when you look at the train track. I put this up here to show the dramatic, instantaneous impact of heavy, sudden rains, okay? We'll talk a little bit about PHMSA's advisory bulletin, which really emphasizes the fact that rainfall, heavy rainfall, is occurring in different parts of the country than it has traditionally. Or maybe heavy rainfall in areas where for decades it hasn't seen such dramatic weather patterns, right? We have to think about it, and we have to think about how it could impact. I am sure this railroad company was not expecting this kind of washout, and I'm sure the pipeline company was not. The question is, should they have? Could they have predicted it? I don't know. But so this is a very dramatic a washout area here. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, a couple things here. I was on this site. These are my pictures. So a couple of things. You've seen pictures of this. You can see that this is a very hilly terrain. You can see the distance. You can get a good idea. The actual issue is right here. But what I want to show you is the perspective where I was standing from. Can you go to the next slide? I was up here. What this whole landslip area, and I'm probably using the wrong term because there's different things, slips and slides, and if you're a geologist, there's very specific terms, and I'll probably get them wrong. So if there's any geologists in the room, my apologies, including you. But you can see this dramatic area, and there was land movement all along here. Obviously, we know what happened there. What you're also seeing, this was a gas line, so there was ignition. So a lot of these trees you're seeing are burnt. The other thing I want to point out, can you go to the next slide? So there's a really interesting thing. This area is, the failure would be down here, right? The interesting thing is, you notice the funky shape of these trees? Do you see the bend in them? There's an actual term for that. I couldn't come up with the term. I can't remember it.
Pistol butt.
Thank you, pistol butting. And what happens is when the trees are growing, they grow straight, right? But as the land starts to move, the bottom of the tree moves. So the tree keeps trying to grow straight. So it develops this very characteristic shape. What does that mean? It means that the land movement has been occurring for a long time, right? Might be very, very slow, but it's moving. Those are warning signs. Those are things that you need to be aware of and monitor. And I bet members of the public, as you go around your community and you see areas that you got those hills, look and see if you can see some of this. You might be surprised. The earth moves everywhere. Sometimes Mother Nature makes her move really fast. Okay, you want to go to the next slide? You already saw this. Ooh, boy, that's really out of focus from up here.
Yeah, it is.
Did I put the next slide in, or is this the last one? Yeah, this is a better one. Many of you saw this yesterday. This is the Sartarsha, Mississippi failure. Intermittent heavy rain. So in this situation, there were periods of dry weather, heavy rain. And then dry weather, heavy rain. So it was intermittent. The soil saturation here was very different. Now everybody says, well, Mississippi gets a lot of rain, right? But things change, and soil is not always stable. And a lot of people would say, due to climate change, weather patterns are changing. Areas that might have otherwise been stable are no longer stable. So what are the warning signs? What do you got to look for? When you look at Sartarsha, you can see the drop slip here. This is where the pipeline failed. A lot of people say, what is that white stuff? When carbon dioxide exits the line, it's going to basically freeze dry. Now, that's just basically ice, dry ice. It'll freeze the moisture in the air. Okay? I think that's the last slide.
Okay, Jim, could you talk about these slope failures and washouts and various other geohazards and how they can affect systems?
Sure. So geological hazards is a very broad term, and it covers essentially anything that can negatively impact the integrity of a pipeline. And I use I use a very broad term. Within the CFR, they use the term outside forces, which is actually really good because that's even broader still. So it would include geological hazards and hydrotechnical hazards. What we saw in the first slide today was a hydrotechnical hazard, not quite a debris flow, but a very rapid flooding of probably a relatively benign channel that probably had a 2-foot culvert in it somewhere below there, below the railway tracks to convey water, and due to the heavy rains from the hurricane, it washed it out. So geohazards include sort of mass wasting processes that would be landslides, landslips, avalanches, rock falls, those sorts of things. Rock indentation, is considered a geohazard. So a rock that is coming up from below due to frost heave, for example, and frost jacking that you would get in the northern states, that would be a geohazard. Erosion and earthquakes are both geohazards. Permafrost, so the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, the photo that you see in the corner of each slide is the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. It's elevated on piles for about 1/2 of its 800 miles. So about 400 miles of the pipeline in Alaska is elevated and held above ground on vertical support members because the ground underneath it is ice rich, and the hot pipeline would cause that ice to thaw, and the pipeline would then settle, and that would cause an integrity problem. The other half of the TAPS pipeline is buried because it's in terrain and ground that is thaw stable, meaning that it would not settle as it thaws out. And so permafrost tends to be a potential geohazard because of the risk of thaw settlement, or conversely frost heave, where you have, say, a gas pipeline that is traversing between 2 compressor stations that has Joule-Thomson cooling, decompression cooling as it moves from one compressor station down to the next. If you're in a discontinuous permafrost zone, as you approach the second compressor station and the temperature is below freezing, you could get frost heave that would jack the pipe upwards. So all of these are geohazards. I consider mining subsidence or ground subsidence due to underground mining. So as a problem in the Appalachians with the coal mines, longwall mining represents a geohazard to the pipeline. So anything that an interaction between the soil and the pipeline that could negatively impact that pipeline's integrity, to me, is a geohazard. In terms of the damage that these can cause, some of them can be very benign. Surface erosion is generally a relatively benign issue for the pipeline integrity, but it could lead to larger problems further down, exposure of the pipeline. And that's usually not a good thing from a safety perspective. One of the ways to design pipelines is to if you ensure the integrity of the right-of-way, you usually ensure the integrity of the pipeline at the same time. And whereas the converse is not true, you can build a pipeline and design a pipeline that is strong enough to withstand many of the outside forces, but your right-of-way may collapse, may go to hell in a handbasket, and that's not a good thing, because if you are on a slope that has a creek at the bottom, your pipeline has good integrity, but your right-of-way fails and causes debris into the streams, then that's an environmental issue. So if you work the other way and ensure the integrity of your right-of-way, then you often, in most cases, ensure the integrity of your pipeline. In terms of climate change, and Linda has mentioned this also, is that what we are seeing is a change in the weather patterns, and often more frequent and more intense rainstorms. And there are, in many places of the world, including North America, good records and relationships between rainfall intensity and duration and landslide initiations. And in fact, in places such as the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State, they've got very good plots of being able to plot landslide initiation as a function of rainfall duration and intensity. And that can be used, graphs like that can be used for integrity management purposes of pipelines. When you get an event like that, you can see whether or not there's a risk of landslide initiation, and you can, the pipeline operators can be proactive and implement a surveillance event to go out and look at the pipeline immediately after to see whether or not there's been any signs of instability developing.
Thanks. Rich, we're going to bring you into this in just a sec. Linda, you also wanted to talk about the 2 advisory bulletins.
Yeah, so thank you for putting this up. So, and sorry, I didn't know if we were going to do it later now, but so we did issue an advisory bulletin following the Sartasia event, landslide and pipeline failure there. And what we did is we took a previous advisory. We had issued one already. We updated it to reflect some of the new information we had coming out of Sartasia, what we were learning. Also, you'll see a renewed focus on the whole concept of the climate change impacts and things that are changing in our world today. In that advisory bulletin, there's a lot of information about techniques, sources of information that operators can use. But the main message of the advisory bulletin, and I'm going to be pretty direct here, the operators in the room know I'm pretty direct, hopefully fair, is that we know that there are issues. It is a company's responsibility to make sure they address issues and look for issues before they become failures, right? The question is, you know, when you look at how much can you predict? Can you predict Hurricane Ida? I don't know. Can you predict? Can you look at culverts? Can you look at places where you are seeing that pistol butting? But I don't know. I have a block on that. But where you're seeing that and monitoring it, can you put monitors in the ground to watch? Do you have a program to go out and look for these areas along your system? Because it's your responsibility to do so. Right? So this advisory reemphasizes that there is a need to be aware. Things are changing, folks. There have been too many geohazard failures that hopefully we could have prevented. So we're leaning into this, saying we're making you aware. Now let's get together and figure out how to stop it. Can we assure no future geohazard failures? No. I wish we could. But we would be remiss if we didn't do everything we can to spot and prevent them, right? Especially if you heard from the young man about the impacts of the Sartasia failure that had on him personally, right? So we have an obligation. We can do it. We gather more information. We learn as we go. Are you going to prompt me for the next question?
No, I'm gonna put you on the spot right now. So, the last bullet there says owners and operators should consider monitoring geological, environmental, blah 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 blah. So, I got to tell you, when you sent this slide and I looked at it, so the words "should consider" give me a bit of heartburn, particularly given the way the circuit decided to deal with consideration in the ERW situation. So there are existing regs for design, for operation, for not operating an unsafe pipeline that apply in or out of high consequence areas, whether or not integrity management applies. They should be doing a whole lot more than considering, in my view. And I'm am worried that PHMSA is still 2 advisory bulletins in, saying should consider. So I'd like you to address that, and then I'm going to put Rich on the spot and have him talk about the marathon incident a bit.
So I kind of knew that question was coming.
Oh,
I mean, I know Rebecca. So here's the reality. Our regulations clearly state that operators are required to maintain safety of their pipeline, period. They are also required to address any adverse condition, right? Where our regulations are not as specific is there is nothing in our regulations that say currently, thou shalt have a weather monitoring station and thou shalt do A, B, or C. There's a lot of ways you can monitor land movement. There's a lot of different approaches you can take. And so the regulations do not give a very specific method. It's not prescriptive. And I know that's a topic of debate, prescriptive versus performance-based, right? So, and this ties in here. When we do an advisory bulletin, we are not allowed, we are prohibited from putting in new requirements. That would violate the APA, what is it called? American Procedures Act? Or Administrative, I should look to my lawyer, my Administrative Procedures Act. So for us to put something very specific and say you will in an advisory bulletin, I have to have the backing of a regulation. But by golly, if I find an operator that has a land movement issue that doesn't address it, I've got an advisory bulletin that says you should be addressing these things, and I have a regulation that says if you have awareness of an adverse issue, you must address it. I can combine those. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Just before Rich describes his problem, if you saw the previous presentations, you saw that geohazards tend to be a relatively small percentage, typically 7% of the overall loss of containment type issues or failures. The problem with that is that when they occur, they tend to be catastrophic. So even though they're a relatively small number, they tend to have a very high consequence.
I'm going to go out of order here for a second and skip Jim's 2 slides. These are images that Rich brought from the marathon failure outside Edwardsville, which has been talked about several times in several panels, and Chairman Hamady mentioned it yesterday. I'd like, Rich, if you can walk us through this and talk about how you handled it.
Yeah, I can. So at Marathon Pipeline, we did have a Geo Hazard Management program that we had implemented prior to this event. And we were monitoring pipe strain, which is an indicator of, or can be an indicator of a geohazard in this area. But what is missing within the industry, and if you were here during the last panel, you heard others discuss it, but is a lot of the technical background to know when to act. And that is missing. And so it is a developing threat as we learn more about, the outcomes that can occur. And so that's an important part to remember here. And so while this was being monitored, it was below action levels. We were using what was one technical paper that Inga had put together earlier several years ago, and it did have some action levels. We were following that. And if you look at this first picture here on the left, our line that's closest to that creek there is really 40 feet away. And, there's not a lot of repose or change in the topography there. It's relatively flat as you get down to that creek base. That's only like 10 to 12 feet. And, thank you. And so that's 40 feet away. And it's about, like I said, 10 feet down there. And the rest of the area is relatively flat. And this pipeline had been in the ground for 70 years. And so you wouldn't say to yourself, gosh, this has got a huge area for, some type of land movement or geohazard related event. And while this is still being investigated with the NTSB, I think we all agreed that yes, the primary factor here was geohazard in nature. And there was not a large storm event here that was recent before this. There was say it had gone up a 1-year type flood event, the week before. But yet, here we are. And as we look back and our data shows, you can see we believe this pipe was installed straight, as these red lines indicate. But here, this picture here, you can definitely see a bow, right? And that horizontal movement is indicative of a geohazard event occurring. And we heard, again, in the other panel that these events can occur slowly over time. And yet we believe that this was not something that was happening, I'll say, in the last 65 years or so, but very recent. And that is one of the phenomenon that we're continuing to study and to understand. And one of the things that we thought was critical was to share some of these things as quickly as possible. And that's one of the key takeaways that I want everyone here to remember, is that we'll learn together and we'll learn better the quicker we get this information out. And so that's really a critical takeaway here for all of us is, there are things that are being done in the industry that are advancing this science to help us better predict these type of events. But we will only learn all of these things if people share them quickly. And I realize there are obstacles to that, but I encourage everyone, especially on the operator side, to share these events within the industry so that we can all learn from them and improve.
Thanks. So we talked earlier about the two relatively independent sets of requirements, the general requirements for all pipelines, and then the integrity management rules applying to those pipes that fall within those. Linda, can you talk about how you inspect for compliance with those two sets? And do your inspectors independently look at routes to try and identify potential geohazards and check operator plans to see if they're adequately monitoring? How do you do that? Do you check their strain gauges? How's this work?
So, wow. Oh, boy, you went right to the technical piece. She mentioned the strain gauges. So, boy, it's such an open question. So the first question is, do our inspectors check for hazards like this? Yes, they do. When they go out and they look, they're going to have a conversation with the operator. Do you have any safety conditions? They will look at, maintenance records. They will look for things that will indicate maybe there's an issue. They also do right away. When part of our inspection, by the way, sorry for this 10-second, part of every inspection includes a procedural review. Do you tell your people, do you require your people to do the right thing, right? Records review, does it prove that you actually did what your procedure said? And then the third part, which I want to talk about, is our field inspection. And that's where people go out and look at facilities. As a former inspector, I spent many hours driving right away, looking for things. There are things that during an inspection, which I don't want to talk about in this forum, but there are things you look for that would put a red flag up in your mind if I need to explore this a little bit more. Indications that might make you think, I need to look at this area. You look at right-of-way patrol records where a pilot might say, hey, I saw something in this area. You look for indicators and then you go out and you try to find them. Do we find them all? No, we don't. There's no way we can. There's a whole lot of miles out there and we don't see all of them. But we do our best to look for the indicators that there's something that we should dig in on. The other thing is there are, you want to see an operator that has a robust approach, that's looking for things. If you go out and you inspect a pipeline operator and you talk to them, by the way, every time we do an inspection, we pull up the advisory bulletins and we say, hey, are you aware of this advisory bulletin? What are you doing about it? Are you conscious of it? Whether it be cyber threats or it be geohazards or what have you, what are you doing? And operators in the room by now know that if you say, oh, we don't have a problem with that, that is like waving a red flag in front of an inspector, right? Somebody says, no, we don't have to worry about that, right? Am I right? I see some people nodding, yes. So we want to see that there is a response, that there is a thoughtful approach. Now, having said that, if an operator has identified geohazards, If they have a robust approach to look for them, and they have found them, we're going to look to see if they have a program to address them. So Rich mentioned that Marathon had a geohazard program. So we're going to look to see, what does that include? Does it include in-house reviews? Does that include bringing in expertise? People that actually know what they're talking about? No offense to Rich, but people like...
Or B.
People that actually can look at this stuff and understand it. Are they getting the right kind of information? That is where we have to stop. Because I'll be honest, we don't have too many geohazard experts on our own team. We can't be experts in all of the areas, but we can look to see that the company is using expertise and pulling in the right type of insight. And when we see that missing, we have a serious conversation with the operator. The other thing, just going back to the other issue we were talking about, prescriptive versus performance-based. So outputs matter, results matter, right? If a company is having geohazard problems and they have a geohazard program in place, is the geohazard program adequate? I'm asking you. I'm trying to read your faces. I'm asking you, is it adequate? What would you say? Our colleague from CER, would you say it's adequate? I'm putting him on the spot. If a pipeline company has a geohazard program and it has a geohazard failure, is it an adequate program?
No.
I would agree with you, except, this is where I'm going to give you that, are the situations that we saw 10 years ago, if that geohazard program was developed 10 years ago, and things have changed a lot, might it be that the program just has not kept pace? And might there be new information we're learning? So when you look at a situation, and not putting Rich on the spot, they had a program, they had a failure. Does that automatically mean they're not doing what they should be doing? It means they have to do more.
Go ahead, Rich.
Would you agree?
Yeah, I think what it shows is if we're using our safety management system, we talked about plan, do, check, act, it just means that wheel needs to spin faster sometimes.
Yeah.
And, as a result of this event, our wheel was spinning really fast. And our goal here was to make, changes to the program in weeks and months. And that's dollars being spent that, within months to make significant changes in how we're, viewing our assets. And again, some of the other things that change is the technology, right? We talked about some of these threats are developing and the action limits aren't well established. There's no industry guidance. And so as you develop these things, there can be challenges. And that's, again, that talks about how fast that plan, do, check, act wheel needs to spin. And in this instance, it needs to spin pretty fast.
Well, I'll do a little bit of self-disclosure. Back in the 1990s, I think, there were a lot of landslide movement failures or issues in the Pacific Northwest. Anybody have up from that area? Pacific Northwest? Oh, Bellingham. Oh, duh. Okay, that was kind of a duh moment. Okay, was that in the 1990s or the early 2000s? Whole bunch of landslide, heavy rains. Yeah, 2000. Okay, thank you, Rick. So I actually was involved in a bunch of actions with certain pipeline operators who installed land movement sensors on their pipelines because they knew the land was moving, but it was moving at like a half an inch every 2 years. It wasn't, and it had been predicted that it's going to move really slow, but they wanted to monitor, so they had real-time monitoring devices put on these pipes so they could monitor and make sure it didn't get past a critical point, and they measured the strain on the pipe and the stress on the pipe to make sure they didn't pass a critical limit. You know what they're using now? They're using ILI tools. They're called IMUs, inertial movement, and they check the position of the pipe. Technology has dramatically changed. I've also understand that there's using some satellite devices. So there's the technology from back in the early 2000s in 20 years has dramatically changed. So the program that those companies had in the early 2000s you know, it needs to be updated. Maybe the technology needs to be updated, right? We're looking for different things. We're looking for rainfall in other areas, in new areas. It's a point of opportunity. We have to keep up with the times. The world is changing, and we have a responsibility to keep up with it to the best of our ability.
Rich, can you talk about what the inspection process is like for PHMSA inspections from the operator's perspective, looking at geohazards in particular?
I'd say it's been pretty intense from our personal experience.
In the last 6 months?
Yeah. But in all fairness, very good challenges, right? And questions that are being posed. I think they realize as well that there are some emerging threats here in terms of how we respond. And you know, there are some things going on that they're participating in PHMSA. There's a GTI, Gas Technical Institute, that is putting forth a white paper. Inga, we heard earlier this morning, is developing a phase 2 of their white paper to help us determine response limits. And, you know, API is working on a recommended practice for Geo Hazard Management, API 1187. So there are some really good things out there that, you know, are helping us along. And again, PHMSA is challenging us on the threats that are existing on our pipelines. And so that's a broad category, especially when we talk about some of these physical threats. And they are looking at us as operators to understand what those are and to have the programs to assess and to address them. And so we understand that while not everything is written as you spelled out earlier, we understand the performance-based nature of the regulation. And we have an obligation to meet that and do our very best to do so. And so, yeah, there have been a lot of detailed questions around that. They do look at the detailed threats that we say are on the pipeline, and then they dig into, you know, how are we assessing and remediating them over time. And so it is, we want to think of it as a collaborative effort, but we also understand they are the regulator and coming in, and we want to be transparent with the data that we have.
I'm going to go back a couple slides now. Jim provided a couple of slides talking about the usefulness of operators hiring geotechnical and experts, and I wondered if you'd talk us through these two.
Sure. So this is not a plug for consulting work. Thankfully, I'm semi-retired, so I'm not necessarily looking for more work. But what we see from this is a document that was written by Mike Sweeney, and he used to be he's retired now, he's the chief geotechnical engineer at BP in England. And he did this study to look at the effects of geoprofessionals and their input into pipeline design. So this is not so much about operations, but it's about original designs. And you can see that, you know, the historic practice in the 1960s and 70s and that had very minimal geotechnical input. And with time in the last, you know, several decades, more geotechnical input has come in. So we've got geoprofessionals, geologists, terrain analysis experts, geomorphologists, geotechnical engineers, all starting to look at and become part of the the pipeline design process, from initial routing and avoidance of potential issues through mitigations during construction. And you can see the progression in terms of how the loss of containment events have decreased with that input by people looking at geological hazards.
Rich, do you want to comment on that,
Yeah,
or should I move to the next one?
Yeah, I will comment on that, because I think most companies that are operators that are looking to lay new lines, they are doing that as part of their process and involving geomorphologists for stream movements and understanding the impacts that can happen or can have, and then same thing on the geotechnical side to find the best route selection or the best mitigating elements that you could put in place to remediate any type of issue before it becomes a problem.
And this is a description of pipeline releases.
So this table here describes some of the costs of cleanup and the impacts of pipelines. Now, not all of those are geohazards, but Dos Quebrados in Colombia in about 10 years ago, that occurred on December 24th. And it was a 6-inch gasoline pipeline that ruptured at the time for unknown reasons. The gasoline flowed down a ravine into a creek, into the Dos Quebrados, formed a vapor cloud, moved down about a mile or so, and then found an ignition source in the village of Dos Quebrados. And as a result of that, my recollection is that there were about 20 people who died in the initial explosion, and another 13 died in the days after. And I was on site on January 2nd as part of a team looking at that. Others, major events, the North Saskatchewan River in 2016 was a crude oil pipeline that ruptured due to landslide movements, and it cost approximately $80 million to clean up. A lot of these, the point of this table is to say that if a company has to pay $10 million or $100 million to clean up, that buys an awful lot of geohazard monitoring. And it's a relatively, and it saves the company, what's not showed here is the cost of reputation and the cost of social license, the loss of social license. And by investing in geohazard monitoring, you save that money and it pays back big time in most cases.
Can I
Sure.
mention something? So, the one thing thank you for providing this chart. I noticed the Yellowstone River, the vortex shedding. I distinctly remember that. So when we think of land movement, a lot of times we think of land movement onshore in the middle of like on a hilly terrain or whatever, but we often forget that there is a real issue with pipelines at river crossings, creek crossings where you have erosion. And it's one of the most challenging for pipelines that are trenched in. Sometimes if you'll do a HDD, a horizontal directional drill, you don't have those issues. But for many of the pipelines in this country, they were installed post-World War II, right? So you have some older pipelines that were trenched in, and they're going to be subject to the erosion. So you have that type of land movement. And what happens with a pipeline that is crossing a river, right? So you have a pipeline, here's a riverbank, and here's a riverbank, and it's secure, but that riverbank goes apart, that pipeline can start to vibrate. And what happens is you get stress points on the pipe and it can fail. So operators constantly have to look for these type of issues. The other thing, when we were talking offshore folks, do we have any folks that have offshore facilities, especially in the Gulf? Okay, can y'all testify that hurricanes do offshore land movement?
I can testify. I'm a loop within our portion. We have 48-inch lines, 4-inch lines in the Gulf of Mexico. And after hurricanes, we have to go out all the time and do hazard analysis to see if we go out after hurricanes and validate that our pipelines are still in the right of way. And sometimes, especially 4-inch or smaller lines, we see those lines move quite considerably, and we have to recover those lines.
Thank you. That's exactly what I meant. This is not just isolated to onshore in the hills of Kentucky or Ohio or wherever. Offshore operators have the same challenges. It's not easy. And putting a sensor on those movements on offshore pipelines can be even more difficult than onshore. So
the last slide I put up here gives the docket numbers for the two advisory bulletins from 2019 and 2022. There's a third docket number up there, which is for a public informational meeting to be held in a couple of weeks.
thank you.
There's information in there about how to register for that. You can participate virtually. Linda, in 30 seconds, can you tell us what you're hoping to get out of that in terms of Geohazard?
So that meeting is going to have a deeper dive into geohazards. So it's a 3-day meeting packed with a lot of technical topics. We need input, ideas, and thoughts. The world is changing, right? We have to adapt. Many of you have expertise that can contribute to our decisions as we move forward as a regulator. There may be things that we need to start looking for. There may be things that we're headed off in the wrong direction. So when we talk about land movement, that's a whole morning. I mean, it's like several hours we're going to be talking about it in depth. Bring your input, bring your ideas. We'll have a means for you to provide feedback.
Great. We've got about 10 minutes to take questions. We've got mics, or at least one mic. He's coming.
Okay, only easy questions.
Okay, Travis Hallam, 3 affiliated tribes, Pipeline Authority. It's Richard, right?
You're Rich.
Okay, I'm going to give you a free pass because you purchased the property afterwards. And both the pipelines I'm going to talk about are obsolete now. But I've said it before, I wish you were more assertive, because when I referenced a property that before Marathon owned it, but now you did, and now it's obsolete, it was weight bearing of soil, a 20-foot section at a pinch point in a volatile terrain right next to the water. I reported it, they chose not to address it. So then I reported it to PHMSA, and you said, as long as they're saying it's not an issue, we don't consider it an issue. They have to self-report. So then I partnered with the Corps of Engineers, we had dialogue, and since then, instead of being an adversary, they became an ally, to a point where another time, they were building an isolation valve closer to that area. And I said, why are you building this? And they said, because you told us to build it. So it became kind of comical, but you don't have regulated distances between your isolation valves. So we wanted to narrow the volume, the spill volume, and we asked them if they could build something closer, so if that volatile terrain was to have a failure, you wouldn't have so many thousands of barrels coming. And they did that freely, after I had that discussion with them. But this was stuff from me having that discussion, not being led by PHMSA, and that's where I said I would appreciate it if your group was a little more assertive. And that's another way how we got from 1 million gallons spilled to 0 is by being assertive. And another group here, Cenex, has been really good about this and being proactive. So one of the things left out was tornadoes. We had an above ground gathering system attached to a bridge, and everybody thinks it's safe. And I had the dialogue with them long before I saw this occur. And I said, if a tornado comes through there, this pipeline's at risk. Let's put a downstream or upstream check valve so it can't backflow into Lake Sakakawea. They did that. A few years later, now twice, I've seen tornadoes impact that bridge where it's snapping light poles and other fixtures. And when I told them about it, they came through and inspected all the brackets to make sure that pipeline wasn't at threat. But they've been a really good proactive operator to the point where they've rerouted their line to make it safer, to avoid these river crossings and stuff. But some of these views, they're there. People just don't seem to want to see them. And as far as seeing that photo running parallel to a creek, as a regulator, I'm thinking I would never approve that. We don't allow anything within 1,000 feet of the water because our saying is water is life. And there's other alternatives. And HD boring, like you said, it wasn't available till 2008. No instance of that failure coming into a river. So it makes perfect sense if you're approving it or you're building it to take these extra steps and do it properly. So that's all I wanted to say on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Travis. Chuck?
Can I say thank you to
Oops.
him? Travis, thank you for being here. Throughout this meeting, I've heard Travis speak up on issues, and he brings real situations. It's not theoretical, it's real. And I want to thank you because not only are you telling us what we need to hear as regulators, as operators, as whomever, but you're also talking about how you resolved issues and how you persevered. And I think that's important. Sometimes we get tired in our pursuit of doing the right thing, and you didn't. So thank you for staying in there.
Chuck?
A question about Can you all hear me? Okay. A question about the geohazard programs in the companies with, I think a couple of y'all alluded to it, with the changes with climate change is one of the things that I worked for a watershed protection department in the city of Austin for 30 years. One of the things that we saw over the 30 years that I worked there with climate change is really rapidly increasing stream velocities and volumes. And so, like you were saying that pipeline had been, Rich, had been in place for 70 years and without a problem. And so it's not surprising at all to me that you see a problem now. And so are companies putting programs in place to reevaluate all their pipelines on slopes that have probably been stable for decades, stream crossings that have been stable for decades? Because with climate change, I think that is necessary.
Yeah, what I can share a couple things on that. As for the stream crossings at Marathon Pipeline, we look at it, at all of them, and have a fluvial morphologist look at recent data, within the last 4 or 5 years forward, and try to analyze what type of scarring or other type of events that we should be aware of. And so that's built into the geohazard plan. So we're using real data there that's recent, and within that we also use the gauges that the Corps of Engineers have in place to help us understand if there are high water actions that are occurring right now. So that's real-time data. As it relates to the geohazard program, so yeah, for us, we're looking at that and running these IMU tools that Linda spoke about here just a little bit ago, and we're looking at that basically almost all of our segments. And so that establishes a baseline, and then from that baseline, we, as needed, will bring in geotechnical engineers and other experts to help us analyze at the location itself. And then, based on some of those criteria, then we look at how frequently do you need to go back. It might be every year that you're going back and running those IMUs to continue to keep an eye on it, or you're putting other real-time devices like inclinometers that measure the slope, and is that changing over time? And then those are real-time measurements that can come into the control room as needed.
And then a follow-up, and this is kind of specific. The pipeline in Edwardsville, did you put it back in the same place where it failed?
We did. But with that, we have an agreement with the local community and with PHMSA that we're putting in retaining structures along that area to help mitigate any issues in the future.
So Chuck, when you asked the question of Rich, now I think the people in this room probably know by now that Marathon's out there leaning into this. And there are many companies that are, bigger companies, have the resources to lean into massive geohazard programs, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I probably can't ask you how much the financial or resource impact. The ones that I worry about are the very small companies. They have less exposure perhaps, but the small companies that don't have those resources.
And we've met with individually a lot of the larger companies just to share best practices and what's being done. And in fact, we have another best practices sharing, I think, like next week planned. And yeah, other companies have processes in place, and then others, it's a continuum as mentioned, and some are farther along and some are ahead. But it's good to see, and then people can see the best practices during these info shares.
Chuck, I'm going to go to the back. We've got time for one more question. Paul?
Yeah, it sounds like route selection is pretty important to avoid picking dangerous routes in the first place. Would PHMSA support having better awareness and information for state route regulators to be able to pick and ensure that routes are selected intelligently and appropriately?
Hey, I'm always a big supporter of giving people more information. Now, having said that, Paul, to be honest, FERC regulates siting. We aren't allowed to talk about siting, but there are a lot of good resources out there. Many of you may or may not be aware that FERC regulates siting for natural gas pipelines. Interstate. But on the liquid side, there isn't an equivalent for the liquid pipelines.
Yeah, the
So
state's
it falls to
regulated
the
on the liquid
states.
side, so
Yeah.
that's why I asked. But I understand that PHMSA doesn't regulate route. The question was, would PHMSA help support and provide information to states so that they can regulate route? Or is that going to be left up to the states to figure out on their own?
I think it's a great idea, more information. How do you do it? But it's
We got 1 minute.
a good idea.
Okay, any last 30-second?
Travis?
I got one more.
Glenn,
I don't
can,
need the mic, it's just simply, the other thing I would recommend is, we've seen it before with Bridget, they had done a bore, but it was what I call a shallow bore, 25 feet, and the impact of these hill slides is closer to 40. So, on our boundaries, we require a 45-foot or greater bore. So a shallow bore, even though you think it's safe, can still be impacted, which we've seen, but we have never seen a 45-foot depth bore be impacted, even though we've seen a lot of hill slides and near misses. So just for everybody, if you're doing a bore, try to go deeper to avoid that potential.
okay, with that, thanks, everybody.